All right, hello everyone. My name is Wasi Muhammad. I'm the executive director of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, which is located in Oakland. This guy, I'll just keep him. Oh, sure, thanks, appreciate it.
Put that in your pocket too.
Yeah, it reached the ground, so I'm going to try that for now. Thank you. But I'm also the state director of Engage Pennsylvania, which is a Muslim political advocacy organization. Today I'm mainly on the religious side with the Islamic Center. Has anybody been to the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh? Well, you're all invited. Anytime you want. 7 days a week we're open. We're open for 5 prayers a day. And anytime anybody ever wants to schedule a visit or want to come over for one of our community dinners or barbecues, everything is always open. And if you want a special tour and a special guided thing, it's always can be easily set up. It can be a whole group. It could be one person. We're always open to anybody who wants to visit. So. What did you guys talk about today so far?
I was just giving them basically my personal perspective of being a Muslim in Pennsylvania. So it was more of a personal talk.
Yeah.
Some questions about Salat, so we covered the 5 pillars in some detail, but not a lot.
Perfect. Well, so typically, I apologize for being late. I actually had car trouble, and I got a friend to drop me off 40 minutes. So, I'm really thankful that he did that. So I'm glad I could make it. I think he might pick me up to take me home, which will be exciting. So that is actually the first part of the talk, right? So just to give you a breakdown of how this typically goes, which is usually we have a little bit more time, 1.5 to 2 hours. So we'll truncate the whole thing anyway. So the 5 pillars is something that we start with, right? The basics of the faith, right? And Islam, in the sense that we try to get the point across that it is not just like a collection of rules or anything like that. It's like a worldview, that we would have, that is formulated and created. And that's how we see things through. So the 5 pillars, in and of itself, to understand those 5 pillars, it's all part of the understanding of this is our worldview, and this is why these things make sense as forms of worship, right? But then in and of themselves, the 5 pillars are just like a house. If you have pillars, you do not have a house, right? You need the pillars to have the house. However, you need the rest of it, right? So usually after the 5 pillars, the next thing that we talk about is these other things that are the 6, I'd say you could call them pillars, you could say 6 parts of Iman, which means faith, right? So in the 6 pillars of Iman, and when I say Iman, I might do that repeatedly, it translates to faith from Arabic, right? So one of them is to believe in God, right? Which is similar to the Shahada, which is one of the pillars, right? So the belief in God and the oneness of God and monotheism is a key pillar of faith, right? And the fact that it's like an all-powerful God and all that kind of concept, that's one of the key, one of those 6 foundational pillars, right? To believe in the concept of angels, right? So that's something that's interesting. If you're not from an Abrahamic faith, that's not normal, right? Lots of the world does not know what an angel is. Muslims, Christians, and Jews have the concept of angels, and it's one of the key principles that we have to believe in it, right? So it's purposeful that a lot of it is logical and objective, and a lot of it you can actually look at, but there are parts of the religion, that we have to just, if we believe in the religion, you have to accept it, like angels, right? None of us are going to see one, but it's a part of that. So there's other forms of knowledge like that. So this is kind of symbolic of you have to have that understanding and you have to have that belief in faith, right? To believe in the messengers of God, messengers are the ones who've brought down books. I can't remember the number exactly, but I think there's 124,000 prophets, in the history of time, and then we only know a fraction of them, right? But we know that any people, they were sent down a prophet to lead them since the beginning of time, right? And then most of them are not explained or we don't learn about, but we learn about some so we can get the picture of a concept of what does a prophet do. And then when a messenger, there's a much smaller number of messengers, brings down a message, right, that they have a clear role. So prophets and messengers within the religion, we have to believe in them, right? That's one of these pillars of faith, right? So in the prophets and messengers beginning of time, from all races, backgrounds, speaking every language, all people have been sent a prophet or a messenger that speaks a language that they can understand and can speak to their heart. So that's like from the beginning of time is our belief in that sense, right? So it's interesting. People think that, and our prophets, if you think about it, like Abraham, Isaac, Jesus, these are all people within our tradition as well, right? It's similar to the other Abrahamic faiths. I don't know. Is that a thing within your tradition? I'm actually curious. Like that there are way more prophets and messengers than mentioned within the tradition. Is that I feel like you might know. Yeah. That was something I did not know. Only the last couple years that I realized that about our faith, actually. That how many of them and how significant that fact is. I always wondered, all of the messengers and prophets that we know of, say within the Abrahamic traditions across our faith, are kind of from one region of the world, and then they kind of even related at times, right? So from the same family tree and all that, and I thought that was always interesting. That how come? But then thinking about it as that this is just to focus in on a particular place and time and group, so that we understand the larger concepts, because every culture and place before them received similar guidance, but something more culturally specific to them, right? So then it makes it seem less like any culture you would have picked, it doesn't seem as arbitrary, right? It seems like this is purposeful that we understand it, but it's not like we're leaving other cultures out of it purposefully. It's more of that this is an example that God is trying to show us through this region, that helped me a lot, try to understand how come other parts of the world, why don't we have a book filled with prophets from every corner, and they all kind of shared the same message and they had different experiences, and we don't want to question God in that sense, but this one, helping to understand the wisdom of how the Quran was structured and how the Bible was structured. In terms of message, number 4, to talk about the Quran, to believe in the books is the 4th pillar of Iman, faith, right? And I say books plural because there are 4 books known to us that we know were brought down, right? One is the Torah, sent with Prophet Musa alayhi salam, Moses. The Psalms, Zabur, sent with Prophet Dawood, David. The Gospel, Injil, sent with Prophet Isa alayhi salam, Jesus. And the Quran, sent with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So the Islamic belief, right, the Muslim belief is that this is, if you think about this concept of all these prophets and messengers, and if you think of all of that, right, it's one progression, right? There is one God. All forms of spirituality and knowledge is kind of from that main vein and source. So another culture, we believe that these extremely important figures throughout histories of different regions, like I'm from India, there's a lot of people throughout Indian history that are considered extremely important, and then potentially mythological, depending on, how you understand the history. But there is a thought that these could have been prophets and these could have been messengers, and we don't know, but there were significant figures throughout world history. Right, and then we believe in all of these books. So we believe in the concept in terms of worldview, right? Not I don't want to think of it as an in-group and an out-group, right? This is a Muslim view, this is a Christian view. We believe if we put on our Muslim glasses of a worldview, that there is a God. Everything in the world is from this God. Everything in the history of the world is from this one God, right? And all of our understandings of God in its different ways will be clarified on the Day of Judgment, but it doesn't change the fact that there is one God, right? So we might be doing something that's off from what was originally the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, brought down and told us to do, but we're not exactly sure. We might have differences of opinion on who Abraham was, or what happened, or the stories about his sons especially we may differ on, but we think that there is an ultimate truth, that none of us are going to know it, until the Day of Judgment, which we believe, which is a future one. So 5 is a belief in this concept of a Day of Judgment, right? That's really important. It's core to the belief of Muslims that eventually things that we do in this life matter, right? We are a faith and works religion. We have to do ibadah, which is forms of worship, but faith really, really matters as well. And then at the time, even within the tradition, groups differ on opinions on different parts of the faith, but there will be a day of clarity that brings us all together. And every single time we pray, every single day, 5 times a day, all year, numerous times we'll say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, God the most gracious, the most beneficent, the most merciful, however you translate that. Mercy is a key concept, right? So we hope that mercy will be given to all of mankind. And then that is the day that we are focused on what deeds that we do when we were alive, right? So Day of Judgment also really, really matters, right? So we went from the, just to recap, the believe in God, monotheism, to believe in His angels, to believe in His messengers, to believe in His books, to believe in the Day of Judgment. Finally, the most convoluted one, which we don't have enough time to talk about today, is we believe in the divine destiny. Right, so predetermination, however you call it, like in the Western concept. So we have this understanding that nothing happens or occurs except that which Allah has determined, and that is impossible for anything to happen or occur without Allah having determined it. All good and bad was determined before the existence of creation, right? The philosophical debate on that first part is complicated, but really it's that last part that we focus on. That when people really have issues with faith and they're struggling, it's that thing. All good and bad was determined before the existence of creation, right? That's a difficult thing for people to tackle, of any faith, right? Like, how can there be so much bad? You know, oftentimes when people are shaken in their faith, it's after something really awful happens, right? And we believe, in a sense, that there's tests given from God, and that's not a sufficient answer for a lot of people, right? That when bad things happen, and then you have to look at the concept and the context that there is wisdom. All of these pillars, all of the parts of faith, all of the parts of the religion, and the concept of the good and bad and the tests only makes sense whenever we, as Muslims, really focus on the concept of an eternal soul, right? That's important. So if you have a horrible illness when you're a child and pass away, we believe that as a child, that is, in a sense, it's a blessing, because if you believe truly in an eternal soul, right, you are forgiven if you die as a child, right? That you have a clean slate. You don't have an opportunity to have any blemishes on your record. So you're guaranteed paradise, right? So as opposed to all of these, why do we pray 5 times a day? I say, think of that eternal soul and that spirit as like a battery, right? And we get low on charge sometimes. Every 5 times a day, you charge up a little bit, right? You plug in, and that's why you have to stop everything that you're doing. Anything that you're doing, that for a couple minutes, there's nothing more important that you could be doing than praying right now. Right? And it helps to keep you grounded. It helps to recharge you spiritually, to take you out of the dunya, which is our concept of the worldly life, and take you into the spiritual life for a couple minutes, 5 times a day. It's not that long, right? But it's important. What's up?
I have a question for you.
Go for it.
One is, when I was reading the Quran that if a child died,
Yeah.
they have a clean slate to go to paradise.
Yeah.
My second question for you is, what do Muslims teach about miracles?
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you repeat
Miracles.
Oh, miracles. Okay, sorry. The first one, what was that?
You said when a child died,
Mm-hmm.
they have a clean slate to go to paradise.
Yes.
Okay. Is that something that's teaching in Quran?
Yeah.
The second, my question is, what do Muslims think of miracles?
Yeah. So in the Quran and Sunnah, which is most of the rulings and understandings are derived from, the concept of if you pass away, you do not, we have this concept of your deeds are tracked, right? However, when you're too young to understand what you're doing, and you don't have the ability to sin, really. Not off the top of my head, but right after that I can find that for you. I'll pull it up. I don't want to take time out of everybody's, but yeah, there's that is not a debated concept either, right? Amongst all of the different traditions within our tradition, yeah, that's clear. You don't even have to pray as a child. Prayer isn't mandatory upon you. Fasting is not mandatory upon you. These things people do them, but you don't have to do them. Because you're not at an age, usually it's like puberty, there's some discussion of when that starts, but when you become an adult, right, religion is a very complicated concept, right? So like to expect a child to fully understand it, most will come and get exposure to the religion. It's good to give exposure, but is it really upon them to take time as a 6-year-old to pray 5 times a day? No, that's not a concept. So similarly, and also miracles within the tradition definitely exist, right? Like the miracles of Jesus, a lot of the miracles overlap. They're the same within both tradition. Some are different. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we believe had miracles which is not in your tradition, so all of those miracles are different. So those miracles are from God, and no prophet has any special power to do this. It's just that they ask God for a sign to help push some kind of thing with the people so that they may believe. And it was done, right? But mainly, it wasn't within the Prophet's life, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there's several instances of miracles. However, it is not like an overwhelming theme. It's kind of like he wanted people, the Quran was the miracle. Like in and of itself, the final miracle of mankind in our tradition is the Quran, right? It's a linguistic miracle. If you look at the tradition, that's our belief that it couldn't have been put together by anybody else. That's why a lot of people believed at the time that this is not the best poets of the age, which it was a society that was valued its poets. It sent its best and brightest to be poets of the village, right? So they could not replicate it. So that linguistic miracle and the wisdom within it was the last miracle, right? That was the miracle that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, focused on way more than other kind of the miracles that we think of water to wine or something like that, right? So it was more about that one miracle was his life's focus, right? The Quran. That was the primary. Does that make sense?
Okay, so in what age the child considered as if nothing happened to them, that they go to Quran? The second thing is, if that is the last time if the miracles occur, how do you guys live how is the life of a Muslim in today's world when the miracles you guys talking about is still in that?
Okay, so the first one clarifying, I'm the executive director of the Islamic Center and not the religious director. So I only go over particular information that a scholar has told me that I can say this, so I know it's simple, right? I can say the one about the kids because it's simple that I know that, but the age specifically is something that is above my knowledge, right? But generally I've just been told it's puberty, right? So which is a range. When you become an adult, it's not necessarily you are 13, right? So that's whenever you enter into adulthood. In terms of miracles, living our life today, we believe that miracle is still there. That's why the Quran is so valued. We have dozens of people in the area who memorize the Quran cover to cover and can recite it beautifully, right? Every Muslim has parts of it memorized, right? In order to pray every single day. Since the Quran was first brought down, it's always been an oral tradition, right? So much so that you can go to every corner of the world right now and find people memorizing the Quran word for word the same. And you cannot change a letter. If you are reciting in our Friday prayer, 700 some people, right? If you're reciting and you make a mistake on Surah Al-Fatiha, every single person will know that you're wrong. There's no misprints. You can't mess up on printing a wrong copy. You can't do any of that stuff. The oral tradition and the clarity of that allows this to be maintained over generations. And no matter, there have been misprinted editions, there have been leaders at times who've tried to print alternative versions, and nothing has ever stuck. Right? There's not multiple Qurans that really exist throughout the world. Any other editions are not considered real, right? There is specificity in how letter for letter the entire book goes, right? And that's very much maintained because we believe that is the last miracle that we can see today on earth every day if we reflect upon it, right? So, yes.
Well, give me some viewpoints of a Muslim in the West, and the way you guys practice your faith, and Muslim in Africa. What are some differences? Some way you guys view your religion and Muslim?
That's helpful. So this will help me as a concept from later in the talk. So basically, Islam is a thing, right? Like that's the concept, the ideology, the faith, the religion. Then there's culture. There's 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. Every culture has impacted Islam. Islam didn't come and delete the culture of the local area, right? It's like I'm from India, right? Islam came to India because of merchants who came, spread the word. Everybody converted. Like there's like 600 million Muslims in the subcontinent now, give or take. It's like a crazy number. That was not done by conquest, and that did not say that, okay, once you all become Muslim, there goes your culture as Indians, right? You have to get rid of your languages, you have to learn Arabic, you have to get rid of your dress, you have to dress like the Arabs, it is meant to be complementary, right? So that being the case, there are lots of instances where cultural understandings of morality that existed before the time of Islam have stayed and became conflated with the religion, right? There are things that Indians do that we think is part of the religion. And then there are things. So at the Islamic Center, the reason I found this is fascinating, because we have over 50 nationalities just at the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. If you come on a Friday, we have over 700 people coming for prayer, and everybody is from everywhere, and then we have to sit and figure out, where like this brother's from Somalia, this brother's from Nigeria, this brother's from Bangladesh, this brother's from Algeria, this brother's from France. All of us have a different understanding of this one holiday, what is the right way to do it. So then we believe, take away everything that's from the culture. In order to break your fast during Ramadan, I don't have to eat a samosa. That's just like an Indian thing that we do, right? But the sunnah is eating dates, milk, water. So then we have to refer to the primary text and do that, right? So the simple answer is, there's lots of cultures that are Muslim. And they, because of their own cultures, will do things that they feel like are the right thing to do, but are not actually related to the religion. But whenever a parent teaches their child right or wrong, or what to do, or how we're supposed to do things, and they don't understand the difference between this is because of the religion or this is just because of my family's culture, and then over generations it gets confusing. The beautiful thing about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now, and America generally, is that all of these different cultures are now praying together, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in mosque, and we have to then figure out what is the religion and what is culture, right? So that's often conflated throughout the world in lots of different religions, and then we just have an opportunity in America to kind of delve into it, right? But there's no simple, I can't say that, this is the African culture of Islam, because there's several different cultures within that continent, right, that Muslims practice different ways, right? But the 5 pillars is never different. The Quran is never different. The basic principles, the 6 pillars of Iman are never different. There are basic things that make you Muslim, right? How you dress, how you might get married, how you might do other things, they might differ because of their original cultures, but it's not really related to the faith, in that sense.
Is the concept of Sharia law Muslim, or is that
Yes,
cultural?
It is Muslim, absolutely. So Sharia law, 70% of it is how you live your day-to-day life, right? How I pray, do I cross my arms or leave them at my side? It's very mundane, right? And most of everything related to it is personal, So Sharia law is in America turned into this really, really very negative, right? So and the thing is, it's very strategic why you make Sharia law. Do you know it's canon law, it's canonic law? Is that what it's called in the Christian tradition? Or is there a form of law? Church law. Yeah, church law. So it's kind of saying that if you demonize the term church law, if you're in a country that the English isn't the language and you use the term church law and they don't recognize what the term means, and now it's suddenly bad in your mind, that's a great idea, because this is actually because I want to get into Q&A. It seems like people have questions. The only last thing is why did Islam get so negative, right? In the minds of Americans, right? I've reflected a lot about this, right? How do you get from the things we're talking about, the 5 pillars, the worldview, to this it's creeping Sharia, conversation within the United States of America? My thing is that it is clear to me that if you look at American history, which because of I grew up in America, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is where I grew up, capital of the Keystone State, central Pennsylvania, which is very interesting growing up there, and realizing that in American history, it is very, very often the case that minority groups are just scapegoated for periods of history, and that's from the Irish No Need Apply to the anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia to Japanese internment, Chinese Exclusion Act. It's they're all chapters of American history that pick a minority, right? So looking at Sharia law as a specific example. Why does this scapegoating happen? Why is this the American tradition, unfortunately, of picking a group? So in Sharia law, there are several countries or states around this country that introduced anti-Sharia legislation. Has anybody heard of that? Bills that ban Sharia law from becoming the law of the land. First, does anybody know why that's really weird to do? It's random. You cannot, based on the Constitution, have religious law be the law of the land anyway, right? So it's already against the Constitution if suddenly all of Pittsburgh's politicians were Muslim and they wanted to institute, Sharia law or whatever that is. Which is, first of all, Sharia law actually tells us too, if you're living in a country that is not a Muslim country, the Sharia law says follow the law of the land, specifically. So interestingly enough, that's telling us to not follow Sharia law is telling us to not follow the laws of America. But this Sharia law instituting any kind of religious law in America is against the Constitution of the United States of America. So why would a politician introduce legislation to ban Sharia law from becoming the law of the land when it's already impossible, right? Because it benefits them. They get a lot of media coverage, they get a lot of column inches, they get donations, they're saying that we're fighting for your security as Christian Americans. That is the whole narrative, right? But in essence, nothing was accomplished. That is a useless piece of legislation. Every Sharia law, anti-Sharia law legislation that was passed so far in America has never once been used in court. And it never will be. Because you would never have to. It's a publicity stunt, right? And then why do people demonize the Russians and all these anti-communist stuff? Or why did the Japanese become vilified in a bunch of movies and articles and whatever? It's that you need to create some kind of enemy, right? And focus on that enemy and then say, I'm going to save you from this enemy, right? If you build up the Muslim community, who are primarily people of color, who have a faith that's different, that it's so different in people's minds that nobody even understands that it's an Abrahamic faith. Right? That we believe in Jesus, that we believe in the Bible, that we believe in all of these different things. We have angels, we have messengers. It's a very similar faith, right? But if you ask the average American, they've never met a Muslim. They have no idea that this is in any way related to Christianity, as opposed to it being a sister faith, right? I think it's more similar to Hinduism or Sikhism or another, non-Abrahamic tradition than it is close to Christianity or Judaism. Right? It's because it's purposely done. In the American media, there's a Malala Fund through the Kennedy Center did a study, right? 68% of mentions of Muslim Americans in the media in the U.S. is done by journalists, right? 8% is by other, like a random assortment of groups. 21%, this is since 2015, has been done by Donald Trump, right? And 3% is Muslim Americans talking about Muslim Americans or Islam. Right? We don't get to tell our own story. And what sells in this country to the media outlets is that there's a threat that you have to follow on the news, right? What do politicians want to talk about? Like a faux enemy that they can win, they can beat, or they can defeat. And what do certain companies want is that if you demonize the enemy, like the Japanese, you can drop 2 atomic bombs on them and people will think it's acceptable, right? And right now, if you demonize Muslim Americans, you can invade Muslim countries, kill 400 civilians in an accidental airstrike, and have nobody in the U.S. care at all, right? This happened last year in Iraq, right? Like, if that would happen, we should care as Americans, right? We can go to war, that's one thing, right? But when you accidentally bomb a hospital and kill 400 civilians, that's a big deal. That is not okay by any standards of military etiquette or whatever, right? And it happens, but if it happens so consistently that our airstrikes are just demolishing historic sites, demolishing all of these areas. We should care. But we don't, because the enemy has been demonized, right? And it's effective. American history does, like my history teacher when I was at in central Pennsylvania would call it the USA is the United States of amnesia. You know, like we forget this. We don't remember these parts of our history, because then it's this like turning wheel of which minority group is the current scapegoat, right? And once it turns, the other group is so happy to get out from under the wheel that they just kind of move on with life and then just become more American, you know? And then whoever then becomes at the bottom, it's the same playbook of demonization and using the media and doing laws and legislation until they've been accepted. It's like if anybody's in fraternities or sororities, like hazing, you know, like to get into America as a minority group, you know, like you have to go through your pangs. So. But if you look at it like comparatively, right, it's the same exact thing. Like between Japanese and the Muslims, right? The rhetoric now versus the rhetoric then is identical in a lot of ways before internment happened, right? That's why a lot of Muslims are freaking out, you know, like because we're a couple steps away from that. Because if you can ban people from Muslim majority countries from coming right now for the Muslim ban to talk about something relevant, recent, right? The thing is that if you say national security, you can do whatever the hell you want, you know, like anything and nobody cares. All you got to do. So 180 national security experts, you know, from Republicans and Democrats all said that there's absolutely no link between Muslims or like religion and then the acts of terrorism, right, in the Western world or et cetera, right? It is mainly politically motivated and all of these other reasons, right? So they said that the Muslim ban does not make sense by national security standards. However, you cannot ever guarantee that one person you let in from any of these countries may commit some kind of act, right? So if that's enough, then you might as well block the whole country, right? If you're going to agree with that rhetoric, instead of looking at the national security experts saying that this is a low probability, right, why would you not intern Muslims? Because there is a chance that one Muslim from any area in this country may do something against the country, right? So within that same logic, internment of Muslims is a step away, right? And the thing is, we are really regretful as a nation of Japanese internment mostly, right? Most people are regret, like the government has formally apologized. A lot of people throughout the world has condemned the U.S. for this action, and the Japanese Americans have not committed any acts of terrorism since being released from internment. You know, like this is all, it was a ridiculous, embarrassing episode of American history. But once you cite national security and then make an entire 1.7 billion people into the enemy, despite what background that they're from, all of a sudden you can take away lots of rights, right? The constitutional protections are no longer offered to this particular group of people, right? And at the end of the day, if you look at the reasons for why it happened, lots of minority groups throughout American history have had these things stripped from them. And in hindsight, we're regretful of these times, these instances of what's happened, right? Slavery to internment, to these immigration laws where we had these quotas, right? You know, all of these things. In Pittsburgh's history, I have this, Mayor Peduto tells me this story like 50 times a year, like of the, have you guys ever heard of the anti-Catholic party, you know, like in Pittsburgh, right? Like they, whenever, I forget the name, but like they had a mayor elected, right, who was currently in prison at the time. He ran for mayor and won the mayoral election in Pittsburgh and became like Bob Barker, I think is like Mayor Barker. And then he, from a prison cell, the governor had to pardon him so that he could come out, so that he could get sworn in. And then right after he got elected, you know, he fired everybody off the police force and hired all his friends. And then he immediately shut down the Catholic Church because of illegal water tap-in, and then arrested the bishop, you know, like at the time, for that illegal water tap-in, right, which may or may not have been illegal, you know. So like even in our own recent history, that was because the Catholics, like primarily like Irish and Italian, I believe, were coming, and that was, they said, if you have gotten here after 1870, you are not American, right? Like there's quotas going to be on your people. You're somehow outside of the thing. So if you came here after that time, so the Irish and Italian communities in Pittsburgh really took the brunt of that, right? But the wheel spun. And then they are no longer, at that point, and the legislation has been changed, the quotas have been removed. It's no longer acceptable to put a no Irish need apply thing at all. The police force and other places have really changed in terms of their acceptance of those particular cultures, Irish and Italian particularly. So this is an example of a group being scapegoated, right? Like Bob Barker was telling everybody that the Irish and Italian are coming for you. I can protect you. Right? Like, we have a band of people that will save you all, right? And then he used that to become mayor of Pittsburgh. And then he used that power to shut down their places, pretending like me shutting down the Catholic Church, or Bob Barker shutting down the Catholic Church, was going to save people, was going to protect people, right? In no way did it do that, but did it get him very popular? It did. Did it make his supporters think that he's actually following through on whatever he was saying? It did, right? So mainly, Islamophobia in the United States of America, our message when we go on and do these talks is not it's already a rampant thing, right? We don't want people to hate Muslims. We'll answer any questions you want. The rest of this time will be Q&A. But in reality, I kind of want everybody to take notice that there's going to be some other minority group probably within our lifetimes that's going to be the new group that we should be afraid of, that we should hate, and that we're going to start doing these things. And consistently, politicians, corporations, mainly the 1%, will use this to distract the general public from things like healthcare and infrastructure and the basics of what we should actually care about, to think that Islamophobia, if you poll the American public, it's really high. Muslims are a very high concern, right? They think that we're 1% of the American population and way too many people are scared of us, right? We do not have the ability to impact it. However, crumbling infrastructure in Pennsylvania is a real issue, right? But if you actually poll the American public or the Pennsylvania public and ask everybody, are you more concerned about creeping Sharia law or the infrastructure? It's Sharia law, and that's a problem because a congressman or whoever can just protect you from the Sharia law because there's no real threat. And then it can then you'll love them for that, and then they can never fix the infrastructure, and they'll keep getting elected, right? So that Sharia law legislation example is an example of people clearly abusing the system in order to stay in their seats and to maintain power without actually doing anything to help the public. Already something that is illegal, there are now new legislation on the books to prevent it from happening. There's no reason for that except taking advantage of the American public. So the real victim of Islamophobia, of anti-Japanese sentiment, of all of this stuff, has always been the American public, from distracting us from what's really important. Right? We're 1% of the American population. The people who really suffer are the rest of the 99% who have to hear about Islamophobia day in and day out, and so much media and so much attention is focused on this thing that has nothing to do with what's happening, right? So I have an interesting to end on before we just do questions. So I looked this up, right, a lot. I did a lot of reading on it. So in the 1st century BC, the Roman historian Sallust wrote that the Republic had descended into internal strife because of destruction of its enemy, Carthage, in the Third Punic War. Fear of the enemy, or metes hostilis, produced domestic cohesion. Without an adversary, Romans turned their knives inward. When the minds of the people were relieved of the dread of Carthage, wantonness and arrogance naturally rose. And then that was the fall of the Roman Empire, right? So when you create an enemy, you build this social cohesion, right? And you bring people together. And when you lose that enemy, when it's defeated, when there's, in American history, there's areas of risk and areas of safety, right? When you're in an era of safety, inherently, it is a different time. In summary, the presence or absence of external danger has always had a profound impact on American domestic politics. Eras of threat are characterized by American unity and consensus, but conformity is stifling and dissent is not tolerated. Eras of safety are characterized by the acceptance of radical and self-critical perspectives, but there is a strong sense of fractiousness as well as uncertainty about America's role in the world. Oftentimes, outside danger is only noticed in American politics when the menace is present, but the absence of threat is also a fundamental dynamic. If you look at which legislation is introduced and what is tackled and what issues we focus on in these areas of threat and safety, it completely changes American politics, right? And then people ideally, if you're not thinking about the best interests of the people, want people to think that we're in an area of threat because you do what you have to do to keep us safe, right? Wartime powers, take it all, right? We lose our liberties, we lose our whatever. We give away things like, still in the Patriot Act, we're still figuring out what we've given away, right? As American citizens in terms of our freedoms, right? To this day, it was because we were in a period of threat, right? And then I don't want to get political in terms of what's good legislation or bad legislation, but it's really just that the American public, our psyche as Americans, in these different times changes. And to make the American Muslim community or whatever minority community a villain is particularly strategic, right? And I never mind if I leave lectures and people don't really like Muslims anymore. I'm mainly fascinated by this concept of think about strategically why, right? It's like when I thought about how can Islamophobia be so rampant and how can Muslims be so hated when everybody I know is a very regular person. You know, they're very average families, they're very normal. You know, they have the same Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological needs, safety needs, self-actualization. It's all consistent, right? How can a group be so vilified? It is just strategically vilified, and it's not like we're the first ones. So we're not special in that sense, right? But unfortunately, my big lifetime concern, because I'm 25, is that this doesn't happen to the next group, you know? Because like for us, we're pretty deep into it. The wheel might turn eventually, just like it has for lots of these other communities. But I want to know who's next. You know, is it undocumented? You know, is that too far for that community? Is it going to be some other country that we get into a conflict with next time? Is it going to be China? You know, like, what's it going to be? And then I want people to focus on the fact that we're all kind of brothers and sisters in humanity, and that even if you say we hated Russia for a time and their government and their politics, hating the Russian people does not make sense, right? You might hate a country, you might hate leadership, you might hate policies, but hating families doesn't ever make sense. You know, like it's just everybody's similar in the sense of what they're focused on for them and their families. Nobody wants these conflicts to really happen, and focusing on that is much more fruitful, right? So, I'm sorry for that random rant. Does that concept make sense? Do we have questions about that? Like, why my personal opinion of the growth of Islamophobia in America?
Old people are next.
Old people are next?
Yeah,
you know,
they can euthanize old people.
Shoot, the baby boomer conversations are there. You're right. Yeah. Hey, you can hide at the mosque. You're welcome. But it's interesting.
I have a real simple question.
Sure.
And a more complicated one. The simple one is I hear two ways of pronouncing M-U-S-L-A-M. Which is preferred? Muslim or Muslim?
Muslim.
Muslim.
Yeah, it's a soft S. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful because I hear both. And then, are there any things that you could tell us that you wish that people didn't misunderstand?
Yeah.
About Muslims or about Islam itself?
Absolutely.
I think sometimes as being a Christian that there would be a few things that people tend to misunderstand, and I just wish that they wouldn't. And I'm just kind of like thinking from your viewpoint, what are some of the areas that we misunderstand about the Muslim community and Islam in general?
Okay. Yeah, I actually have a list of misconceptions, you know, like, and I'm trying to pick which one. There's a lot. So let me pull it up this time. I mean, one we went over, like Muslims are all Arab from the Middle East, you know, like that's a small percentage. Like there are more Indian, by 2050, India will be the most populous Muslim country in the world. You know, and we're not even a majority there. Like the most populated Muslim country is Indonesia right now, you know. But moving on, Islam, let's see, Muslims are supposed to convert everybody to Islam. That's an important one. And a lot of people get that conception from the media, right? Once again, only 3% of the media is Muslims telling our story, right? So in Islam, very explicitly, in numerous cases, what's it called? You cannot force somebody to convert, right? There's no like force within religion, right? Even if somebody like forces a conversion, quote unquote, under threat of death or whatever, it's not accepted, right? And it's actually clarified within the religion several times that we are supposed to spread, like knowledge, and then people can take that or not, right? And it is particularly within our religion to teach people about Islam. Like this right now, just talking about the 5 pillars that's it, right? But any kind of coercion, any kind of forcing, all of that makes, it's a sin upon the person who does it, and it makes the person who converts a conversion not accepted anyway, right? So it's a common misconception that there are just bands of people around the world, like Muslims, going around and just forcing conversions of people and all this kind of stuff, right? But that's never been the case. It is true that throughout world history, there are always groups of people that force other groups to learn their culture and become part of their culture, right? So modern day, this is actually happening right now. There's reports that up to 1 million, there's Chinese Muslims, they're from Turkish ethnic origin, but it's part of China, right? It's a very large ethnic group. That 1 million of them are in these re-education camps, right? And then they're forced to become more Chinese. China is primarily atheist in a lot of their communist teachings and all that kind of stuff. So they are pushed towards atheism. Their beards are shaved off. They're forced to remove hijabs, and that's that concept in China right now. In the U.S., with the Native Americans, if you guys know our history with boarding schools, we would take Native American children and force them to go. There's a 50% mortality rate at these schools, which is ridiculous and a different issue. But the people who come out were forced to learn American quote-unquote culture and remove their own culture from it. So that concept has been there, right? So if I say that within the religion of Islam, is impossible to force somebody to convert because it makes it inauthentic. Throughout history, I guarantee you there's probably some instance of it happening. And not because of the religion, it's because of that social angle, right? Within those Native American schools, they forced Christianity to the Native Americans, right? Was that because Christianity told them to force Native Americans to, under threat of death, become Christian? That's not the case. However, at the time, the primary people in power, their religion and their political views were both forced onto that minority group. And that same sentence can be transplanted to China, modern day, that can be translated to some other Muslim country, I'm sure, at some period in history, right? That's similar. Power dynamics and wealth and power and maintaining those things is usually why things happen. People will misuse the name of religion for that, right? So then the forced conversion stories, if you ever hear them, are never really accurate, right, by religious standpoints. Because I could pull up a bunch from every religion and every faith that does the same thing, but it's not representative of that. Like right now, there are bands of Buddhist monks that are killing thousands of Muslims, right? Rohingya crisis, the Burma crisis, Sri Lanka, it actually just happened where Buddhist, nationalists went and burned all the Muslim businesses down, and there's a riot that happened like a couple months ago. All of these things have happened. Do I think of Buddhism differently because of that? No. Right? Do I think of Christianity differently because of atrocities of the Crusades? No. It's just power dynamics, right? And it's just who wanted to get what control. Religion is often, that's why most of my time is actually spent not talking to religious groups, but having discussions with atheists, right? My fear is people losing faith. I'm happy to meet Christians, happy to meet people who practice something and have some kind of faith. Faithlessness terrifies me, personally. And I love to see, but those debates is okay, well, what has religion ever brought the world except for violence and war, right? That's not true. We would have had that anyway. This is human nature, what people are going to. They'll misuse whatever political or ideology that's popular at the time to gain power. And that's a small percentage of people, but then a lot of people get caught up in it, right? So that's kind of the concept. So no coercion. There's also the concept of Islam oppresses the women and forces them into subservient roles. That's a consistent one. A quick statistic that I bring up to say why that one doesn't really make that much sense. So since 1988, 9 countries have had Muslim women as their heads of state, right? Turkey, Indonesia, Senegal, Kosovo, Kyrgyzstan, Bangladesh, 2 different women in Bangladesh, and Pakistan and Mauritius, right? So all of that that's not possible, right? How could you have, we've never had a female president, the United States of America, right? We haven't reached that point yet. So then, how could, if you don't respect women at all, right? The typical narrative, right? Once again, 68% of it from journalism, 21% from Trump, 8% from other, is that look at this Muslim country which has this oppressive law, right? I could pick out an oppressive law from lots of different countries, like in their development and where they are. I could pick out an oppressive law from our history, right? And we can play this game all day. But what is that? To say that speaks for a religion is really false, right? Those particular countries are not Muslim majority countries by far, 95+% Muslim, right? And then they all have had Muslim heads of state, right? They're female heads of state. So that's possible because of that. So to think of it with nuance. You cannot paint 1.7 billion people with a broad brush. And where countries are in terms of their development has a lot to do with the history of colonization and the history of what's happened in those countries and all of this context that we brush over if we just focus on this one thing, right? And if particularly conservative brands of a religion have taken over a region in this time in history, that does not paint the understanding of the entire religion to all of the world for all of time, right? If that did, then we could just take the worst examples from every religion and make a great case for atheism right now, in that sense. So, yeah, any other misconceptions people have a question about? Things that you've heard. I like as offensive questions as possible, so you can say whatever, I don't care.
A Muslim is a person who follows the Islamic faith.
Yes.
Is that a definition?
Yep. Islam is the faith. A Muslim is the title of somebody who practices.
Okay,
yeah.
What about in Iraq? You've got the Shiites and what's the deal with them?
Sunni and Shia. That's perfect. That's a common thing that comes up. There is like 90+% of the world is Sunni Muslim, right? Mostly when you meet a Muslim, they'll probably be Sunni. But there's a large percentage of Shias in that last 10%. There's also other Ahmadiyyas, there's other subgroups as well. In the US, there's a Nation of Islam, there's like other groups, right? So those are minority groups within the faith. However, we all consider each I work with them all the time. For example, the Nation of Islam called us, they had a funeral, we did it at the Islamic Center, we did that all together, right? All of these things we work together. The Shia community comes and prays at ICP all the time. I've been to events with the Iranian community. It's not as divided. The main thing, once again, to go back to like this conflated political thing, there's a Muslim, large, wealthy, oil-rich Muslim country that's Sunni, that's an ally of the United States of America. And there's a large Muslim anti-U.S. Enemy of the state or whatever that is Shia, right? So then because of these two countries fighting, the media makes it look like the entire Muslim world is in this 50-50% split, right? When in reality, that's not the case at all, right? Like there are lots of families within Iraq, for example, like they always say that fighting between Sunnis and Shias. Most of the families were all intermarried, like they're all related, they're all together. After a particular period of time, it was actually Western powers that supported the minority to overthrow the government whenever we wanted power switches to happen, which is the typical playbook of powerful countries going into smaller countries. You give the weapons to the minority so that then when they're in power, they're your ally, right? So that divided the Sunni and Shia community a lot, but still to this day, there is the entire, these two rich countries, and then one being closer to Russia, one being closer to us, it makes that entire area, the Levant, like the Iraq, Syria, that whole region in turmoil because they're doing their proxy wars within those countries, right? It's not at all, like if you ask the average Sunni or Shia to name the differences between Sunnis and Shias, they cannot do it. Whenever Sunni and Shia separated as two different groups, it was after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and it's purely for political reasons. Is that one group thought this individual should be the leader of the community, the Khalifa, which we don't have anymore. And the other group, as Sunnis, we don't have anymore. And the other group thought it should be this other person, right? Political differences. Over generations, some differences in practice have developed because of that, because of if you choose the different leaders and they took the communities in different directions. So now there are some religious differences, but originally it was just leadership, right? It was nothing to do with faith. It was nothing to do with theology. It was nothing to do with any of that. It was purely to do with politics.
Are both groups true to the Quran?
Yep. Both groups have the same exact Quran, the same exact original text and scriptures. There are some supplementary scriptures and stuff that are different, right? And which books are accepted, there are some differences there. But overall, 5 pillars are all the same. How we pray, is very similar, about the same. Like times of day that we pray and other things. But yeah, so it's really overstated, the differences. Like it's not in it at all different religions. I'd say it's just there are some core things that are problematic in terms of which figures within our history that we respect, right? That matters. But primarily, Shias, Ali radiallahu anhu, who the Shias have a tremendous amount of respect for, he should be the leader, is considered one of the rightly guided Khalifas of the Sunni tradition. And we have to have respect for him and his family, or else that's against our tradition to not do that. So there should be a lot of mutual respect. It's an honest difference of opinion between the two faiths. And if which one you choose to believe is your own issue, and there shouldn't be any animosity, because nothing is problematic, right? Like you may not believe what they believe. It's like different denominations of Christianity. Like, okay, you don't believe like Methodists and Presbyterians, like they're not going to fight each other because they're Methodists and Presbyterians, but if in a political thing there's a Methodist country and a Presbyterian country beside each other that are both oil rich and one is the ally of the U.S., you'll make up some reason that this other culture hates us and then we have to fight them. So yeah, it's not crazy differences like people assume it is because of the media. Yeah.
I apologize if perhaps someone already asked me this question. I had to leave to take my grandchildren home. But if I was entertaining you in my home, is there any food preparation that I should be aware of?
Yes.
That would not offend. I would try not to offend.
Yeah. Well, the main thing is like say we don't eat pork, right? So that's one thing, right? That's a easy thing that within all the understandings, nobody eats pork. There's something called like halal. So halal meat, right? Like that's usually referring to the meat that we eat. And we can only eat particular animals, like we don't eat cats, dogs, and other stuff that like carnivorous animals, right? Like we're not supposed to eat any of those, that's not typical anyway within these cultures. Also, the preparation of the meat really matters, right? So then we believe that the animal could not have suffered, must have been kept, has to be like, say, free range and all these other concepts that are very popular. That has to be mandatory. The animal cannot see the blade, cannot get scared, or must be fed well, and it cannot be sick or anything before slaughtering, and it has to be done in the name of God and with somebody of faith reciting, something while they do it. There's a particular process, right? You can buy halal meat from the Restaurant Depot now or the grocery store, like it's becoming popular enough, or there's like usually Muslim-owned markets that have that meat, right, somewhere. So it's essentially like more organic, quote unquote, or whatever, and there's particular rules on the treatment of the animals, and that's it, right? There are some people, because this is when it gets a little bit interesting, like that say that any meat here, we can eat it. They'll go to McDonald's, they'll eat everything. So it's not like they're ignoring the faith. There are differences of opinion, right, on this issue, and they're completely acceptable. So there are certain scholars that say there's within the Islamic tradition, it says that it is there's a belief that is acceptable to eat meat from the people of the book, right? The people of the book, in our definition, are Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? So, kosher, right? So I eat kosher happily, right? So I think that's completely fine because there's a process that they follow to ensure that these animals have not been abused and the wrong parts of the meat aren't used and the right animals are used, etc., right? So then they said this is a primarily Christian and then secondarily Jewish country, and there's Muslims here. We can eat the meat from America because it's a primarily Christian country. However, some other scholars disagree because there is no longer a Christian process, in their opinion, for the slaughtering of meat. That's like codified and then followed strictly here, right? It's just whatever, there's this Board of Health processes. There's not like a religious process from the Christian community. If there was a religious process mandated from the Christian community for the treatment of animals and the slaughtering of meat, then it would be permissible from both sides. So that's a difference of opinion. One group says it's okay because this is a Christian country, and another group says it's not because there isn't a process, right? People can make their own decision. So it's always like check with your guests. I never assume anything. People are from so many different parts of the world and cultures. They have different scholars who have different opinions. But typically pork is the no-go, and the other meat is always like check. right? Like how they feel. Also, some people don't feel comfortable if people cook with alcohol. Like we can't drink, right? In terms of drinking preferences, so alcohol is forbidden. So we can't do that. So even cooking with it, some people don't like that. Some people don't mind because it burns off. Because mainly it's about getting drunk, and you probably won't get drunk if you cook with some wine. But it's also like a preference thing. So inform the guests about that. Basically just check what their preferences are. And we don't drink. So we're very sober for all this Islamophobia stuff. So at the moment.
Many Muslims I know actually don't even ask when they're invited to somebody's door.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it's not pork bacon related. If the food is really kosher or slaughtered in a specific way, because the concept is that we're invited as guests. This is not the official Islamic view by any means. I'm just sharing with you what some members of our own family do, and vegetarian people who don't speak.
Yeah, that's a safe option. And what she said is very true. There's a hadith, like there's something about that says, like a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, in a situation that you do not question your hosts. Like if somebody's inviting and they know that you're Muslim to your house, it's considered rude to just like check. Right? Like you shouldn't ask. Like, say, for example, if I'm at somebody's house and then I don't know if it's halal or not, and I don't want to do it, I don't take the option of eating it anyway. I usually take just eat the vegetarian part, but I usually don't ask them, like, is it halal? Because but it's tend to be offered. So it's interesting. Sometimes they'll never bring it up because they don't want to be offensive or rude or whatever, but they may choose not to eat your meat dishes. It's not because they don't like them, or they're not trying to be rude, but yeah, being a good host and good guest is also within Sharia, like there's our parts of practicing ourselves. That's really important, like hosting and going places and building that community through sharing food, even particularly. It's said that don't be rude to your hosts and question whether or not they prepared the meat properly, right? Like you should never do that. It's very interesting. BYOB. Yeah. That too. Any other misconceptions? Did I answer your question? Are you good?
Yes, you did.
Perfect, thanks. Or any other questions?
Yeah, we Christians have a phrase, preaching to the choir. That is, the preachers, the congregations in the choir has already heard this and accepted it.
Yeah.
I think we are probably the choir, accepting a lot of what we say.
Yeah.
How can we and you preach to the people who don't accept?
That's perfect. So, yeah, one of the ways I usually close off is talking about this exact thing. Usually people who will invite me or come to the center are the choir. Absolutely, right? However, the people you go and have Thanksgiving dinner with are not necessarily the choir, right? So once you take these tidbits of information, that's one thing. Remember what you can. But also, now everybody has a connection to me. If anybody ever has any questions for me or a Muslim, to actually say, hey, I heard this at the Thanksgiving table about Muslims, but I actually know somebody, most 70% of Americans have never met a Muslim before, right? And never spoken to one, and most, even more than that, don't have a meaningful relationship. So having that access, right? You are now all of our, how to be a Muslim ally training is what we used to call a kind of training we did. Because to become a Muslim ally is just to keep an open mind. And then when you hear something like this, call it out, have a dialogue. Don't yell at people for us, just start conversations. And if you have questions that the group want answered, we will answer whatever questions you want, right? Because our thing is that every person who meets a Muslim, you're significantly more likely to have a positive opinion of the Muslim community if you know a Muslim person than if you don't within America. So all we want to do is meet as many people as possible, and then through you guys, each individually, have your families and friends and circles have access to us through you, right? So anybody who's ever come to any of our talks can always get any questions answered forever. This is like a long-standing offer. Right? So take any information you said. When you hear about the Sunni Shia stuff, now you know that it was a political rift originally, and there are these two countries that are fighting, and now it's turned into this big thing because of this proxy war. It's not a worldwide conflict, right? You know about that we don't force conversion, and that it's impossible within the religion. However, throughout history, people have done things like that in all the faiths. but it's not related to religion. So remembering little facts like this and bringing them up when somebody is talking about it in a conversation where even if I was invited to that Thanksgiving table, they wouldn't talk about it because I'm not there. They will feel comfortable saying things that might be Islamophobic or racist in front of you, but to have the ability to use the knowledge I gained today and then use the knowledge that you can get from us later to address that and bring it up, right? You know, like we would really ask for people to do that. Also, any suggestions on talks at more conservative communities or families or anything that we can do, we love to set up the next ones through usually all of our talks lead to a couple other ones, which is great, you know, so we'd love to get as far. I've driven an hour and a half to 2 hours out just to make sure I get a good group, you know, and churches are always great because they can bring people there that may not necessarily want to hear me anyway because the pastor or minister just like drags them in, you know, so like, that's great, you know, and we also try to do as much media and stuff as possible. So if you ever have suggestions for us to write our articles or op-eds or do anything, however we can reach the public, right, that normally will not hear from us, we'd love to take that opportunity. So we take suggestions. So if anybody has any thoughts on how we can better speak to your neighbors.
I would like to understand this. So if there are communities that you think would benefit from meeting a Muslim, ask them to invite us to their places of worship, to their community gatherings. And we have open houses throughout the year, and I know ICP has welcomed non-Muslims any time of the week, any day of the year. So there are many options available for people to actually form their own opinions. You don't even have to convince them about anything beyond go talk to a Muslim. It's not going to hurt.
Yeah, and we did this thing for the last couple of years, and we always end with this offer as well, that we did these Meet Your Muslim Neighbor lunches or dinners, right? So like anytime somebody can gather a group of people and they just want to meet Muslims, not a lecture, not a talk, you know, like we'll just show up, we'll cook the food, we'll bring everything, you know, like just have a location for us to come, and we'll come to communities and meet everybody, right? And then you can ask whatever questions, you can meet people, just realize that like, you know, we think that'll do more than me just standing up here, you know, saying things that you'll forget when you walk out, right? So we think the breaking bread is a little bit more meaningful. So we have that offer anytime. So anybody wants to do that, it could be here, it could be down the street, it could be at your work, it could be at your home. You know, like we'd be happy to coordinate anything like that, right? Yeah.
So if you go to your Islamic website, you'll have all this in writing?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to Islamic Center Pittsburgh. If you Google us, we'll pop up, and you send us an email or a message requesting whatever you need. You want a tour, you want food, you want anything, like, absolutely, yeah.
But like a rundown of what we've discussed today, is that available on the website?
Kind of. So I didn't, because I'm still like formulating the talks. We don't really have it like published. Although now I guess it's recorded for the first time, so yeah. But we've done a couple talks here and there. We've been polishing it. You know, it turned into the first part of just talking about the 5 pillars and the 6 pillars, where that was originally the talk, right? And based on the Q&A and my own reading and understanding over the years, and working with other minority communities and hearing the Barker stories and all this kind of stuff, it's developed into this, you know, attempt to get people to understand that it's way more nuanced than this religious group thinks this way and it's backwards, right? There's so much that goes into it. And then trying to illustrate that and not just focus on us, but focus on all these minority communities that have suffered before and that will suffer in the future and that are suffering now is the new focus of the talk, right? You know, like Islamophobia gets us a lot of opportunities these days to speak in front of people because we're so vilified. However, we want to take that opportunity to point out a structural concern, right, as opposed to focus on our issues, you know. So like that is not quite, you know, like as you may have noticed, it's not as polished as I'd like it to be. When I polish it up, I might write something and put it on the site and share it, but we're still trying to like tackle it, you know, like I recently added that whole thing about the Romans. I read a book recently that was like talked about the fall of the Roman Empire and how that was because of social cohesion. And the fear of the other is a fascinating concept, and the creation of an enemy, whether or not they're real, and the value that is to the governments and throughout like Western history has been really, really interesting too. So that's all. This is a developing process. You guys caught me in the middle of it. somebody later will get a much better talk than you. So.
The next 2 months, Matt itself, I go to different mosques from London, sequels to. We have 5 talks like this over the next 2 months in different communities that we are doing. But you're right, it is reaching to the choirs and people who are inviting us into their communities, into their churches, and we would love to reach a different audience and a different group of people who, as you said very rightly, it would be actually much more important to be able to interact with.
Question?
May I have to say something?
Go for it.
I think the problem with the society today, it's about God's fear. To love your neighbor as yourself, you need to accept everybody in the eyes of God. When you immediately start to go to one way to show justification how you treat someone else, that's a pure violation of the Bible. So, whether you're Islamic, whether you're Christian, in the eyes of God, we're all the same. But when we start to focus on one, I think to focus because I want to preserve, there's nothing to preserve on earth because we all going to someplace better.
Yeah.
However, the problem with whether the politicians, whether with many ministers in the churches, they start to divide it. The problem with that is because when people trust you with the spiritual life, they usually follow what you say. So my point is, whether you can be Islamic, whether you can be Hindu, whether you can, whatever you are, until you and I start to see people as Christ sees them, there will be no change.
Yeah. I actually agree. I think the concept of a Christian-Islamic war or conflict is an oxymoron. The theologies are not at war, right? It's people and there are whatever reasons they bring to the table. But I feel like as a true practicing Christian and a true practicing Muslim, why are they going to fight each other? Both traditions have things about turning the other cheek and being loving of their neighbor and understanding and teaching each other. Knowledge exchange is expected. Welcoming somebody who's of a different path, is accepted. Welcoming a stranger is accepted. All of these things should be what's expected, not any kind of conflict. And you can't really get there in a very normal way. So there has to be other things aside from religion that bring us to conflict, because the text of the religion would never do that itself, right? So no, I agree. Like the divisions are man-made and not God-made. And there's in the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, even said that we've made you from different tribes so that you may get to know one another, right? And then there's value in diversity. There's value in understanding in people walking different paths and understanding the paths that somebody else has walked in relation to yours. There's so much value in that God created that purposefully. Nothing is by accident. So to use those differences to create division is not at all what is intended in our understanding of what God wanted for mankind. But it is a reality, unfortunately, right? So we do our best to take that away from religion. Like we always, and I know it's like some people will just say, well, this is this other religion. That's what they do over here, right? We just try to separate, there is a spirituality, the beauty of these religions and faiths that exist, and then there's our humanness, right? How much we err and how many mistakes that we make. And then this is why we're fighting, right? Don't pollute this over here, because of this, right? Typically these talks don't turn into a high-level theological debate. That's why they send me. I don't know that stuff, I'm not a theologian. And then I love listening to those high-level lectures, but we never can get there because we're fighting about, other things, right? I don't know.
I think one thing maybe everybody sometimes can relate to this. Ministry minister? How do you guys reach to minister? Because a lot of times, whether what you say, whether we come, we can try to reach out to one or two, but a lot of I think a minister or how do you guys reach politicians? Because they are the one who have a higher say where people listen to them. How do you guys?
How do we reach politicians? Is that what you asked?
Not just politicians, I'm talking about ministers or preachers.
Preachers. Or like ministers. Is it minister as in religious leader?
Yeah.
Okay. The leaders in the Islamic religion, or whatever,
Yeah.
like an imam.
Yeah, an imam. Yeah.
Like imam, how do you guys work to try to reach out to minister as in Christian churches? How do that work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for the Islamic Center, like regionally, locally, right? We are in a lot of networks, you know, Greater Pittsburgh Interfaith Coalition or the Pennsylvania Interfaith Impact Network. And we actually all consistently work together on social issues, which is what I think is the best way to build relationships, right? On social justice issues, right? Like, so we and several churches just had an initiative that we want to bring something to Governor Wolf to help criminal justice reform. You know, like in the system, right? We have some serious issues coming up. To me, interfaith bonding and building, I like that more than the conversations, right? Like we're all committed by faith to serve humanity. Let's do that collectively, you know, like, and that's motivating, right? So we do that a lot. We do interfaith gatherings where we bring clergy together. We have discussions. There was a Sisters of Abraham book club, you know, like that they had, and that they all came and talked about similarities and differences between the faiths. When the clergy get together, like I'm actually developing a talk with Father Tom Hart. I don't know, I can't remember which congregation he's from, if anybody met him. But like we do talks together as well. You know, like we'll sit here, learn about traditions, you know, like together, and then have those discussions. So we don't have our religious director at the moment. You know, we just are getting a new one. But we have an assistant religious director who's here. So that individual will go to lots of congregations, meet the directors, and then form relationships, right? So within the city of Pittsburgh, which is where we are, we're pretty tight-knit, you know, like we do consistently work with rabbis and ministers and pastors and whatever the title is all the time on lots of different issues, yeah.
So I don't know if you were asking about how do you work up to become an imam. So the concept of clergy or imam, anyone can be an imam. An imam is basically the person who's leading the prayer. So you might have different imams leading the prayer on different days. So typically it is the person who is respected in the community, is thought to have knowledge and thought to have learning without religion, but we don't have a very clear-cut distinction between who can be the imam and who not. In fact, often young kids are encouraged to be the imam for the day and to give a sermon for the Friday prayers and to lead the prayers. So I don't know if that was your question, but I think that's also one of the things that it's kind of interesting to me that anyone can really be there's no distinction between being a spiritual leader, having to go through certain steps. As long as you're a Muslim who follows the faith, you can be a leader.
Yeah, we don't have the formal training process like a lot of traditions do, that you have to go to this particular schooling system, you know. Religious directors, like say imams, are the person who's leading the prayer at the time. The scholars that we produce are the most traditional way to learn from a scholar is the foot of another scholar who has ijazah, which is permission to teach. And then that person got it from someone to someone. The scholars that I know, they're teachers, and then they can name their teachers and the lineage of their teachers all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. You know, they'll know that this person taught this person, who taught this person, who taught this person, who taught this person, until they get to them, right? It's like very serious. You don't need a university, you know, if you know that lineage and you have that, right? So there's, it was an attempt to ensure that the government did not take over the process and of religion and spirituality, who's teaching. There are government-funded schools and institutions all over right now, but as a center, will we require somebody to have gotten a degree from one of those universities in order to be our religious director? No. We can find out, do they have knowledge of the sacred text? Do they have the humility that comes with studying sacred texts? Do they understand what it takes to be an imam? Do they have the right training, the temperament, the demeanor? We don't require you to get a degree from this university in Egypt, in order for you to come here and be our religious director. It really, and you may have that degree, and we just know that you're not qualified. It doesn't matter what your credentials say. You are not really right for that. So it's a very different process in a lot of traditions. So. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.